Welcome. The Leadership Lesson podcast inspires leadership growth in everyone. We have enthralling conversations with top leaders in order to provide you with life-changing lessons. My name is Caleb Nichols. I'm a speaker, a pastor, and a family man. My hope is to inspire spiritual depth and leadership growth in you. I love to sit down with leaders from a variety of fields, hear their personal stories and leadership experiences. This creates the podcast. Enjoy. Well, welcome to the Leadership Lessons podcast. Our guest today is Ian Harper. Ian is a professor of economics and director of the Melbourne Business School. He's also on the board of the Reserve Bank Australia, so looking forward to talking a bit about that today. This is actually my second interview with Ian, so very excited to have you here, mate, and really appreciate your time again. This second interview, we hung out a few years ago, but this second one, I'm really looking forward to talking in light of this global pandemic. And so welcome, mate. And maybe we could start off with a bit about your role with the Reserve Bank. What is that role? And maybe tell us a little bit about how COVID is impacting our economy at the moment.
Well, thanks, Caleb. It's a great privilege to be back with you, and thank you for the invitation to be part of your podcast series. Exciting. The Reserve Bank of Australia is Australia's central bank. What that means is that it is a government body and a government authority. It's the government's bank, and the federal government holds its bank account with the Reserve Bank of Australia. And so on the mechanical side of things, people might notice, well, these days you don't tend to get checks from the government. They just put the money straight into your account. But if you do get a check from the government, then it will have across the top Reserve Bank of Australia, because, of course, it's writing a check on its account with the Reserve Bank. But I don't have much to do, if anything, with the mechanical side of what the bank does. The board of the Reserve Bank, of which, as you point out to our listeners, I'm a member. The board of the Reserve Bank is appointed by the government to oversee monetary policy. And that's a sort of bigger set of responsibilities that the Reserve Bank has that I'll explain in a minute. But just, to set the scene, the Reserve Bank is a government body. It is a bank. And so people, the government deposits money with it. Other banks deposit money with the central bank. So as they say, it's the banker to the government and it's the banker to the banking system. But you and I, unless you happen to be an employee of the bank, can't hold an account with the Reserve Bank. And on the other side, you can't borrow money from the Reserve Bank. But of course, the government can borrow money from the Reserve Bank, and the Reserve Bank can lend money to the banks and this and that. So it's part of Australia's financial system, sitting in the middle there, surrounded by the banks and then the various other authorised deposit-taking institutions, as they're called, some of them who are banks and some of them who aren't, and other bodies in the financial system. So the board of the Reserve Bank, it's a statutory corporation, has 9 people on it, and basically there are 3 who hold public offices. So there's the governor of the Reserve Bank, Dr. Philip Lowe. People might recognise that name, and you hear from Philip from time to time as he speaks publicly. So Dr. Philip Lowe is the governor of the Reserve Bank, and he's the chairman of the board. And then there's a deputy governor, Dr. Guy DeBell. In fact, they're both PhD-trained economists at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, in the United States. So they're very, very highly trained and very able men to occupy those positions. So the governor and the deputy governor, and then there's the secretary to the Treasury, a man called Dr. Stephen Kennedy. Stephen is an economist like me and also trained in the same school that I was trained at ANU in Canberra. And Stephen holds his position on the board of the Reserve Bank as a result of his official position as Secretary to the Commonwealth Treasury. So there are those 3. They're, as they say, ex officio. And then there are another 6 people, one of which happens to be me. And those 6 people, the 6 Australians, are appointed by the Treasurer on behalf of the government to serve 5-year terms at different intervals, depends when they get appointed. And those people can be drawn from all sorts of different walks of life. You don't have to be an economist. I mean, I happen to be one. But there are people there who have been bankers, property developers, farmers, people in the retail industry, people in the energy industry. So, there's a wide range of professions, if you like, and skills that are brought to that body. The one thing you can't be is a banker. So you can't be on the board of another bank or an employee of a bank for obvious reasons. There'd be a conflict of interest in that case. That's the only thing the Act says. Other than that, you can be coming from wherever you like. And so the idea is that these 9 people then bring to this question of how the Reserve Bank should conduct its monetary policy all these different perspectives. Professional economists who bring a sort of technical understanding, and then, a bunch of Australians who bring a very wide perspective of what it might mean from their particular perspective, where they sit, what information they can bring to bear on this decision. So I think listeners should take some confidence that the institution is actually set up in a way which enables a wide perspective, a set of perspectives to be brought to bear on a decision which affects everybody, really. And so what is the decision? Well, monetary policy, as many people who watch these things would know, affects interest rates, basically. So the most obvious way in which you would know about what the Reserve Bank is doing is that you hear, or suddenly you realise, that your bank has lowered the rate of interest that you're paying for your mortgage. Or a bank is in touch with you and says, hey, would you like to borrow some money for a house? It's going cheap, right? We've lowered the interest rate. Or the other way around, we've raised the interest rate. So for most Australians, that's how they would interact with monetary policy. They're watching what happens to interest rates. If you know a little bit more about finance and you're a bit more involved, then of course there are influences of those interest rate decisions affect other financial prices like asset prices, i.e. house prices. People would notice that too. And then of course share prices, right? So there's a whole sort of wave of different effects that come as you change something as central as the interest rate that the Reserve Bank charges or sets on its own liabilities. So, Caleb, there it is. That's what it does. If you like, it's about interest rates. At the end of the day, the Reserve Bank is also responsible for the stability of Australia's financial system, and that's a way of saying if there's a need to support financial markets because prices are wildly gyrating, institutions getting into difficulty, then the Reserve Bank, along with the other regulators like the Prudential Regulator and the Securities Regulator and the Treasury itself, would all start working together to make sure that the Australian financial system was sound.
Wow.
Now, you asked about
Can
the current...
Can I stop you there for one moment before we head into the COVID stuff? It sounds like an incredible team, a bit of an A team, the 9 people there. But I think for the average Aussie, it's amazing because the impact from that boardroom on our economy in a phenomenal country like Australia. We're very wealthy, very affluent. We're very lucky. It's a lucky country. It's amazing how you can, and I know it's not this simple, but how something can be something that affects us all, and the country that we enjoy, the wealth we enjoy, can be tied back to almost to a boardroom and to the decisions that have quite an impact on all the different sectors, as you say. Is that sense in the room when you meet, or is it just a job and there's that trust that the whole machine of Australia just it moves forward, or is there that sense for you and the team of I suppose it's almost sacred, isn't it? It's like affect normal Aussies every time you sit down. Like it's some ways it's very personal.
Yeah. Yes. Look, let me speak for myself. I obviously can't speak for my other fellow board members, although I don't imagine they'd have a different view. And we've missed this since we've been meeting online like everybody else with the pandemic. But when we're in normal mode, the Reserve Bank board meets at the headquarters of the Reserve Bank, which are in Sydney, at the top of Martin Place, just near Macquarie Street, near the New South Wales Parliament buildings. And the boardroom is quite a very elaborate, large room, beautifully furnished. But when you come into the bank itself from Martin Place, you walk in and there's a marble foyer. And up on one of the walls, in brass letters, that are embossed onto the marble is the excerpt from the Reserve Bank Act, which says what the responsibilities of the board are. And that is essentially to ensure price stability, which means keep the inflation rate, right, on the right target. Full employment, in other words, make sure people have jobs, right, as much as you can possibly do. And then the third one is it says the economic prosperity and welfare of the people of Australia. Right?
Wow.
The economic prosperity and welfare of the people of Australia, that you're to use the powers that the board has to effect those benefits for Australian people. So I think the answer, Caleb, is it's very helpful whenever you walk into that foyer as a member of that board. You're sort of reminded in your face before you get into the elevator, right, what it is you're here to do. And when it says economic welfare or economic prosperity and welfare of the people of Australia, that I think makes the point you're making, that, if you thought this was just a nice cup of tea and a bit of a chat, then, you better get your act together, right? Because it's a good deal more than that. Having said that, all of the discussions, as you might imagine, for a start, they're all minuted and there are other officials around the table, not as if you're just sitting in a corner having, as I say, a cup of tea. The whole thing is very formal. And then when the discussions take place, they take place as you would expect in that sort of environment, an ordered conversation with people putting their points of view and contesting the points of view. That's not how I see things, and blah, blah, blah. And at the end of the day, a decision is reached about what will happen with monetary policy, either the interest rate or in more recent times, other aspects of monetary policy. And the Act says that each member of the board has one vote and the governor has two in the event that there's someone missing. So there are only 8 people, for example, and then it could be 50. But normally there are all 9 of us there. And so each member gets one vote. And that determines the decision, Caleb. Yep. And the governor, as he's required to do under the Act, right, goes around the room one after the other, right, including the deputy and the secretary of the Treasury. Ian, what do you think? Mark, what do you think? Guy, what do you think? Carol, what do you think? One after the other. And then at the end of the day, the votes are counted and the decision is made. So I think that people should take heart from the fact that the whole mechanism is infused with the point you're making. It is a decision which affects every Australian. And when it comes down to the wire of making the decision, the whole environment and the discussion is conducive to the members taking that decision very seriously.
Yeah. I do chair a couple of boards myself at a significantly lower level than what you're talking, but we very much live in an environment now, don't we, where even governance at my level, church, and I oversee a small private Christian school as well, but governance is taken very seriously, and there's a high expectation that things are done very formally, even at my level. Conflicts of interest and these kind of things are very important to state up front and what have you. And so it's interesting to hear again that despite even the level you're at, it's a similar process. It comes down to a vote. What do you think, Ian? You're thinking of the Australian people. You're thinking of the economy. So what do you think when you hear people say things like, we don't have enough wealth in this country, or I'm missing out, or I should get more welfare, or when you hear this, people are, it's the classic human scenario, isn't it? Human condition, when even despite we have so much in comparison, I saw it during the week when I was just reading a few articles leading up to this podcast that we're actually ranked number 1, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe we rank number 1 in the world for average wealth per person in Australia. So we're incredibly wealthy, but people still complain. That's the human condition, is it? What do you think when you hear that, when you and the guys there are trying so hard to make an amazing economic future for people, and people are still not happy and they still don't have enough?
Reminds you of Oliver Twist, doesn't it? Please, sir, I want some more. Mind you, in Oliver's case, he could do with some more. He didn't have much to begin with.
Probably, yeah.
Look, I think the response to that, Caleb, is to acknowledge, yes, that look, we're all, each of us struggles with that, and people who study the attitudes of people at different levels on the wealth spectrum point out that even if you have a very, very large amount of money, right, people will still say, they'll still compare themselves with others who are further up the tree and say, oh, yes, but I'm not as wealthy as that person. Right?
Yes.
And everybody thinks, if you ask them, well, how much money would it take for you to be comfortable, for you to feel as though I've got enough, right? And the answer to that question, no matter where you are on the spectrum, is always, about another 25% or 30% more than I've got now. Right? Even if you're a billionaire, it's sort of extraordinary how, and a lot of that comes down to, as you say, the natural human condition that somehow or other, I'm, not as well off as I might be. And if I just had that over there, then I'd be fine. And we know that's a mirage. Those of us who've been around long enough to fall into that trap, hopefully learn that lesson. But the more technical answer to what you're saying, Caleb, is that the Reserve Bank runs monetary policy, and monetary policy is only one of a variety of economic policies or instruments which not only can be but should be used to address a range of issues. There is formally in economics that there's a formal rule, if you like, or proposition that you have to have as many independent instruments in order to meet the same number of targets. So if you've got 2 targets, you have to have 2 independent instruments, right? You've got 3, you have to have 3. And it's a bit like saying to a car mechanic that you can't just have one spanner, even if it's an adjustable spanner, right? You can't have one spanner and hope to do all the work that needs to be done in servicing a car engine. You need to have, in some cases, as many different tools as there are different things that you have to do for the engine, but you certainly just can't have one. And so monetary policy is one tool. And aspects of the economy, like you're talking about, the distribution of income and wealth, that's not something that monetary policy can really affect. It's not saying it doesn't have an influence, but you can't really use it to fix that. And people say, well, you're making these decisions about interest rates and it's making some people very rich and other people are struggling and, how dare you do that? The problem is that even if it's true, you've got to say, well, yes, but this isn't the only instrument that we have, right? We have other instruments over here. Maybe if I used a medical analogy, Caleb, if you're having some sort of treatment for some condition and it has a noted side effect, like it might put your blood pressure up or something, right? And the doctor says, well, we're going to have you another drug here, which is going to control the blood pressure side effect. And you're saying, well, I don't want high blood pressure. And the doctor, of course, says, you need to understand this. In order for us to fix the main problem, right, I have to do this. You take this pill. That's going to put your blood pressure up. Well, here, take the second pill and let's sort that out, right? And then we're sort of on track. But if you worry about the blood pressure, you're not going to get the main thing sorted out. So we do need to have more than one instrument. And generally, when it comes to people saying, I haven't got enough, or I'm missing out, or somebody else is doing better than I am, those are policies which are dealt with through the government's tax and social security mechanisms. So things like, JobKeeper or Jobseeker and the tax system, they deal with that issue rather than monetary policy because, make it quite obvious, there is only one interest rate and that interest rate affects everybody. And you can't use one instrument to differentiate, in all these different circumstances that you're referring to. You can't do that. So what do? Not move the interest rate? That's like saying, no, well, I'll take you off this main medicine here because of the side effects of blood pressure. And you can't do that because I came in to see you about the main problem. That's the situation we're. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And it's funny because whenever we complain, whenever we point the finger at humans, it's generally because of our own human ignorance, isn't it? It's often because of our own lack of understanding, and it's interesting. It's great to hear a little bit about it, because I think for your average person listening to the podcast, that they don't know a lot about the economy of Australia and how it runs, and it's interesting. It's interesting to learn. I know one thing that people are concerned about is our economy and the impact, especially the future impact of COVID. Where do you think the main impact of COVID has really been on our economy and on our future?
Well, Caleb, in the short term, the obvious answer is that it's the attempts to deal with the disease have required our state governments and the federal government to some extent to massively restrict the movement of people. So what that has done is to affect the services sector of the economy much more so than the goods sector. So the services sector, which involves people interacting, so we're talking about cafes and restaurants, retail outlets where you have to go in, you can't just do it online. Those parts of the economy have been quite severely constrained. Other parts of the economy, like, for example, our exports of iron ore and gas and so forth, have hardly been affected at all because there are very few people involved. A lot of it's done by machines, automatically loading ships and so forth. And where people are involved, for example, the sailors on the ships, they're at sea for 14 days. So by the time they get to the next port, they're automatically isolated and away they go. So those industries haven't been unaffected, but far, far less affected. And as you would know, those retailers who've been able to go online, in some cases, they've done spectacularly well, much better than they otherwise would have done, because people are spending money. Oh, now's the time to go and get that new lounge suite, or let's upgrade the television set because we're going to be sitting here watching movies every night or whatever. And some of these places have done extremely well. So as Philip Lowe says, it's an uneven impact across the economy. And the analogy that I sometimes use is it's like applying a tourniquet, right? Like you had a snake bite, right? So they apply a tourniquet to the limb of the economy. In this case, it's the services sector, to try and slow up the circulation. Why? Well, you don't want people to get this illness, if you possibly can, until we've got the vaccination rates up. And what that will do, obviously, is to slow down the economy. It reduces the amount of work that's available for people, particularly in those sectors. The good news is that once we've gotten the vaccination rate up, and you can let that tourniquet go, right? Well, to pursue the analogy, the blood just runs straight back into the limb, right? Woof. The economy picks up really quickly once you're able to release the restraint, which is taking the form of lockdowns and so forth. So the reason the government is saying, please go and get vaccinated as quickly as you can, is that brings forward the day that we can release the tourniquet. We can get rid of these lockdowns, right? And people can get back to their normal lives, let alone their normal economic activity. And as they do, the jobs will come back and, away we go. So all of that, so at one level, there's sort of bad news, which is in the short term, there are a lot of people who are going to be and are negatively affected by this, losing hours, incomes down, businesses folding, bad. On the other hand, when we get through this and get the vaccination rate up, that can recover quite quickly. Now, I understand it isn't as easy for someone whose business has had to close to suddenly turn around and say, oh, well, we're going to open the business up again. I mean, sorry, it's gone. Right?
Yeah.
That's true. I understand that. So is there any, is this without scarring? Is there no evidence that we've been through this? Oh, no. So you take a further look down and you say, well, what are the longer term impacts of this? And there's a long story to be told there, Caleb. It will have scarring effects on our economy, and it will change things. Not all of these scars will be bad. There'll be some things that we were hesitating to do that we've sort of had to do, and that they will open up all sorts of doors. My own business is an example of that in higher education. that we've been staring at having to go online, putting courses online and so forth for years. And quite a few of my colleagues, and including me, I'm a bit long in the tooth these days. You think, oh, really? Have I really got to do that? And there are some of my colleagues who, as they say, would lie down in front of bulldozers before putting their courses onto the internet. Well, those same colleagues, let me pay them a tribute. Within 3 weeks of the pandemic having broken, they've gotten their act together. They put their courses online so that their students can continue to be taught.
Yeah,
and
wow.
once you're through that gate, once you've crossed that bridge, well, then you're on the other side. And so now we'll be able to do online education, as I imagine you've been doing in the church as well, in ways you knew you could, but you never thought you would. And now you do. And people discover, hey, I actually quite like some parts of this, that I can, visit other churches online, and there are some benefits to this as well.
Yes, definitely.
So that will change the way we do things. The other thing that I guess I should mention is that we have obviously learned that you've got to be cautious about how dependent you become on supply lines from around the world, right? That there's no doubt that can give you much greater efficiency. So, we've given up producing various things because it's a whole lot cheaper to just buy them from China. Sell the Chinese the iron ore and buy these manufactured goods. Right? That's how come we get a whole lot of cheap stuff.
Yeah.
But when the pandemic breaks and we can't actually buy this, let alone any other sort of political tensions that there might be, just think about the pandemic, then suddenly you can find yourself, whoa, how are we going to produce these goods? We can't import them, and what's going to happen now? Well, it doesn't mean that you suddenly shut yourself off and start doing everything yourself. That's sort of crazy, right? But you need to rethink that, and so we will be redeveloping, right, some aspects of, say, manufacturing in this country out of the need to ensure that we have that capacity. One example, obviously, is vaccine manufacture. As it turns out, we already did a fair amount of that, but we will do more of that in anticipation of making sure that we have the capacity, so that we don't get caught again having to rely on somebody else to produce this stuff when they're saying, yeah, we get you right. You're number 10 on the queue. Just hang tight, and we're saying, hang tight, hey. So that will change the way we do some things in the manufacturing area, and a lot of stuff will be online and stay online, and people will change their work patterns. The whole idea of working 9 to 5, as that's probably all gone. So and a lot of people will welcome that and say, well, I've been struggling with a 9 to 5 for years because it didn't suit me. I've got young children, or whatever the story might be. Now the idea that some people will be at the meeting in person, other people will be online, and some people are doing it here, there, whatever, that a lot of that will be considered just normal. And that will open up possibilities for participation in the work community that have been closed to people who were physically unable to move around as much as other people.
Talking of children, you quickly mentioned them before. I've got 4 young children. We just had our 4th one this year. And my little life group in my church is a bunch of dads, and we've all got young children. And obviously every week in our life group, we sit around and solve the problems of the world. And we've solved the vaccine pandemic problems many times over in our life group.
You got to send us an email, Caleb.
That's right. Economic issues we deal with every Wednesday night. But the guys in my group, you think about our children, and you think about I think the scarring is a fantastic but sad in a way metaphor that you've used for our children in the future. And I suppose our concern is, we think of JobKeeper and all the money spent there that's got to be paid back or recouped at some point. It seems that governments all around the world are just printing money in order to keep their economies afloat. What do you think that impact for the children will be in the future? Do you think it will be as dramatic as it seems, or do you think that we will manage it over the journey and maybe the impact won't be as as dramatic as it appears.
Well, I can give you, let's say, one historical example. It's not a complete parallel, but I think it speaks to the question you're asking. You ought to talk to your grandparents about what life was like as a parent with young children, living through the Second World War, and then perhaps coming immediately after the Second World War. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And the Australian government had borrowed as a share of total output a whole lot more to bring the Australian people through the Second World War than it has this time to bring us through this pandemic. Another way to put that is that we came out of the Second World War with a whole lot of debt. Right? And you could have been there like yourself, Caleb, and your other men in your group, thinking, oh my goodness, right? What's going to happen to these young kids? They're going to cop all this. I mean, at least the war is now over, but we've got decades of having to pay all this back. What's going to happen? Now, you just look at a bit of history and you see, of course, that the decades of the 1950s and 1960s were some of the most wealthy, right? and rapidly growing, low unemployment, right? Decades that we've experienced ever. Now, I'm not saying that we have, you can't just sort of, let's say, as they say, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme, right? And in this instance, you got the same sort of thing. This experience sweeps aside a lot of obstacles. Yes, it's true that the government has borrowed a lot of money. It had no alternative. And to be frank, if somebody said, oh, well, would we have been a whole lot better off if the government hadn't had JobKeeper and hadn't done this and that and just let us just ride this, right, without any assistance? Caleb, that is a counsel of utter despair, right? Again, if people are interested in reading some history, you want to go back and read the history of the depression in this country in the 1890s, in the late 19th century, when there was no federal government and there was no public support when we went into a deep recession then. You want to go and read that if you want to sort of, scare yourself awake at night, that's for sure. That was in that experience, people died of starvation in this country.
Wow.
So you don't want to go anywhere near that. The government did the right thing in supporting, and I'm talking about, just setting aside the Reserve Bank, and I'm self-justification here. I'm talking about the Australian government did the right thing in setting up JobKeeper and in spending money. And this is a conservative government. This is the Liberal Party. Most people think they would never spend anything, right? Well, they did this because, of course, you have no alternative, right, when the times are down.
Yeah.
But what I want to say to you, Caleb, and your listeners, is that you look at that sweep of history and you see that, yes, of course, we came out of the Second World War with a lot of debt. But the Australian economy then embarked on a major period of growth. And part of the reason it did that is the government was investing to reconstruct the economy, and the private sector had a whole lot of opportunities that it could now pursue, partly because the circumstances had changed and people's tastes had changed, and and away we went. Well, there'll be a version of the same thing, that we will have much bigger opportunities, thinking about a whole lot of things opened up for us that we hadn't thought of before, new ways of doing things. Now, that doesn't mean you can just sit there and wait for that to happen. We do have to think about how those young kids you're talking about are properly trained and educated for this new world. We do have to open up opportunities for firms to invest in new online technologies and new ways of doing things, right? And then, so what happens about the debt? Well, what happens is what happened after the Second World War, mate. When the economy starts to grow, right, it will grow much faster than the interest payments that are due on the debt. Because this debt has been borrowed at interest rates like, 1.5% for 30 years, right? 2%. For 30 years, the government has borrowed that. So ask yourself this question. Do you think the Australian economy, right, is going to grow more slowly than 1.5% per annum for 30 years? And if the answer to that is, well, I don't suppose so, I think it's going to probably start growing again about, 3.5, 3, 4, whatever, like it normally does, then you'd say, right, so how are you going to pay the debt back? Well, the answer is the economy is going to grow fast enough for that to occur. Right?
Yeah.
So I don't think that there's no counsel of despair here, but neither is there a counsel of complacency, right? So to those, to you and your other fathers, and my son has two little kids, so I'm directly affected by this. Be of good cheer, right? Be hopeful. That God gives us a hope and a future. He doesn't not out to destroy us. Right?
It's true.
And that hope and a future that will come, that He's promised us, in sort of mechanical terms, right, in real terms you can grab a hold of, is the fact that the economy will respond rapidly in the face of these new incentives. And the government will be encouraging that as well. The private sector is going, people are cashed up to the hilt, looking to spend, right, you name it, whoosh, away we go. And
why are we so wealthy?
Because we've got...
But why has the wealth increased even during the pandemic? Like if you own a home or homes and shares, it just seems odd that wealth has increased while we're in such a difficult period of time with the nation.
Yeah. Well, the main reason for that, Caleb, is that I mentioned the tourniquet before, right? And I said that the Economist describes that by saying that this is therefore a supply side recession. So it's deliberately induced by the government, essentially state government, saying, hey, you got to stay home, right? You can't go shopping, right? That is a supply side restriction. And so the activity in the economy is restricted by that. Once you remove that restriction, back it comes, right? Now, ordinarily, the recessions that we've experienced, particularly really bad ones, like the Great Depression in the 1930s, but even in more recent times, the severe downturn that we experienced, for example, in Victoria in 1990-91, the so-called recession that we had to have, right? In each of those cases, the financial system, the banking system, got into trouble. In Victoria in the 1990s, people will remember, the State Bank of Victoria went bankrupt after 149 years. The government's bank.
Wow.
And there was a raft of building societies, lost money. The Pyramid Building Society and others lost that, they became insolvent. Now, the financial system, when the financial system gets into trouble, that's when you're really in strife, right? Because that's when you can't get your money out of the bank. The stock market is plummeting down like it did in 1929. And people's wealth and house prices are falling. They can't pay the money for the mortgage because they've lost the job. The bank repossesses the house, and then it can't get the mortgage back because the house prices come down and down, right? That's the thing, right? Which destroys wealth. That's the nasty one. Now, what we've done this time by supporting the financial system through monetary policy, right? By keeping people's incomes up through JobKeeper, right? We've enabled two things to happen, Caleb. One, house prices haven't gone down, they've gone up. Share prices haven't gone down, they've gone up. People's income hasn't gone down because they've kept their jobs, even if they weren't working, and their incomes went up, right? And what that has done is to switch off, through deliberate government policy, switch off the nasty compounding downdraft, which we've experienced every other depression, right? Apart from this one. So that one I have to say to you, Caleb, when you say it's surprising, you're right, because it hasn't been what's happened in the past. But mate, I really do have to say, that economists, we got this one right? We've seen how this has happened before, and we've got, guys, income to people to keep their jobs. Make sure the banking system is sound, right? And then we'll get out of this once we can release the restrictions that are there for health reasons. To boil it down, that was the recipe, and the recipe is working.
It's amazing. And I am definitely not complaining because my houses have gone up in value, and I had some smart friends that told me to buy some shares, which I did at the right time last year. It's just, it's incredible. So now, big congratulations, Ian, because I found out as I was doing some research that you received the Order of Australia last year. So well done.
Oh, I did.
That's incredible. And tell us a little bit about that. Why did you come up for that award? What was it for exactly?
For a start, these things, as you know, they come out of the blue, right? That this is suddenly you get a letter from Government House that says, "Oh, by the way, you've been awarded this award. Would you like to accept?" You sort of think, "Whoa, where did this come from?" So some kind person, or more than one, it's pretty, you got to go through the hoops, I guess. But some kind people decided to nominate me, and the committee felt moved to recommend the award to the Governor General, and away we went. The citation talks about my role over the years in economic policy, including monetary policies we've been talking about in this podcast. But I also had a bit to do over the years with setting minimum wages, with recommending reforms to our competition laws. So I've sort of been around the traps a bit. So I think the answer is at least that's what the citation says, in making recommendations and being involved in government economic policy over the length of my career, led them to say, "You know what, we thought you'd done a good job, so here, take this." And I say, "Well, that's very kind. Thank you very much. Done. It wasn't why I did it."
Well done. Can you talk to us a little bit about the leadership side of all of these things you've been involved in, all these different roles, boards, university, you're a professor, all these different things. What drives you, Ian, to be at the forefront, to be a leader, to want to take on more responsibility?
Thanks, Caleb. It's an interesting question. To some extent, my experience is made that I've just been sort of drawn up into it, if you like, sucked up into it. That it's a bit like sort of tap on the shoulder stuff. So somebody says, "Oh, well, why don't you do this?" Right? And that's the moment where you think, "All right, okay, you're right. I've just, I got a few ideas about this, or yes, I feel passionately about that." And now someone says, "Well, why don't you do it? Why don't you lead us?" And at that time, you can say, "Oh, look, no, whoa, sorry. I got lots of ideas. I'm a sort of armchair expert here. I don't want to get involved." Or you can say, "Yeah, all right. Okay, right. I'll lead us into this. I want you to work with me, so don't just abandon me, but I'll commit myself to changing where I need to change, and we want to do this together. I need you to be with me. But if you're prepared to be with me and support me up to a point, right, then I'll take on this responsibility." And so I think people who are interested in leadership, or at least if they find themselves, I think, with those opportunities, I think that's the point. That when you get to that stage, if somebody says, "We want you to do this, would you do this?" You've got to then think, all right, it's not that I'm the only person who could do this, but is there some good reason why I shouldn't, right? If somebody expresses confidence in you, then I think you need to think, yeah, actually, yes, I guess I do owe it to the people who've supported me. And in some sense, if you're a believer, God is in this and is calling for this, and I sense that, then all right, I go, right? Pardon, we were joking before about your wonderful name, Caleb. And I raised the episode in Joshua that people would recognize, that 10 said no and 2 said go, right? And that's the same thing, that when Joshua and Caleb said, "Yeah, okay, we know there are giants." Well, not giants, but this isn't going to be easy, right? But we feel called by God to do this, and so we're going. Who's coming with us? Yeah. And off we go. But for that, I think it's a nice story, because if you think about yourself, there's 2 parts of you saying go and 10 parts of you saying no, right? And each of us struggles with that. You can always find lots of reasons why you shouldn't do it. But if you're called and people are supporting you, then you really, really need to take that seriously. So in each of these cases, Caleb, in my experience, what's happened is that I've had a call out of the blue, if you like.
Really?
Certainly of all of the government appointments that I've had, which is essentially what the award was about, that was a phone call out of the blue. generally from the minister's office, if it's a government appointment, or in the case of the Reserve Bank, it was the Treasury Secretary who saw me at a conference and said, "Oh, can I have a word to you?" And then says, "Look, the government would like to appoint you to the Reserve Bank Board. How would you feel about that?" And so, there it is, right? It's not that I'm ringing up the government and saying, "Hey, I'd like to do this," or that. It's not like that. It's I'm simply saying, "Oh, right. So this turns up," and then you think, yes, I do have the capacity to do that, right? I think I could make a contribution. Could I stuff it up? Of course I could stuff it up. Right? But under God, do I feel as though I should run away from this? And I've thought in those circumstances, no. If I have the opportunity, it's an arrow prayer if I don't have the opportunity. If I do have the opportunity, I'd commit it to prayer and see if I get a sense of that. The other thing, of course, you get a bit of time. Obviously, you ask people who know you well and who would be affected. So I've always asked my wife, look, this has happened. Are you happy for me to do this?
Yeah.
And in the case of the Reserve Bank directorship, which involved me actually stepping down as a partner of Deloitte as I was then, so it would have affected us. I said, that's what's going to be involved here. Count the cost, Jesus says, when these come along. So I counted the cost, and it would involve that. And my wife said to me, she said, "This is something that you've always thought very highly of, right? Always looked at the Reserve Bank and felt that it was such a great institution. And here's an opportunity now for you to be on the board. You need to do this."
Yeah, fantastic.
And so it wasn't just giving me permission. She was actually, and when I said, "Well, that would mean we'd have to change these arrangements," she says, "We changed the arrangements. You need to do it." So that's also very helpful. Counsel.
And so there's a lot of things that you've been involved in that you do, and I love that stepping up, as you've talked about. The opportunity comes, and it sounds like you've often stepped forward, where a lot of people hide behind things, or maybe don't have the confidence, or don't think they're up to. I love the fact that it sounds like you've stepped up more often than not. How do you then maybe, and this is another leadership challenge for leaders, how do you then step out at the right time? Because if you only said yes in your experience, then you'd be overwhelmed now. There'd be too many things. At some point, you've got to say no and step down and change gears, or put effort over here now, put effort over there now. How have you managed saying no and getting out at the right time?
Yeah, that's a very insightful question, Caleb. The Bible says, "Let your yes be yes and your no be no," right? And that's a very helpful piece of advice that it's saying, don't sit on the fence, right? Give this. If you're going to get in, and if you're going to get out. All right, fine. Now, how do you know the difference? Which is your question. In my experience, Caleb, and this might sound strange to your listeners, I don't know whether it would, but I have found that doors open and close for me. And that, I'll give you a specific, for instance. So I was appointed by the Howard government to chair the Australian Fair Pay Commission, as it was called. Nowadays it's called the Fair Work Commission. And that was quite a controversial appointment. The institution was controversial. When the Rudd government took power from the Howard government in 2007, the first thing that the Rudd government did was to abolish the Fair Work Commission. And so let me get this straight, to abolish the Fair Pay Commission, right? And create the Fair Work Commission. And so my position and the position of my fellow commissioners were just abolished. And so that was the door closing, right? That's it. So I'd served my piece, I'd done my bit, and that left, right? In the case of the Reserve Bank board membership, as I mentioned a moment ago, that came along when I was already at Deloitte as a partner, and to accept the Reserve Bank job would involve me standing down as a partner, right? Because I couldn't do the two jobs. So I had a choice there, and I've described how I made that choice. But that, as it were, the opening of one door closed another door. And the case, that you mentioned now. So now I'm dean of the business school. I have a fixed term contract, so there's a fixed end, but it's not impossible that might be a year or so added to it, depending upon where the institution is. And so I will face exactly the question that you're asking. How will I decide whether I'd say yes to a bit of an extension if one's offered to me, or no, I wouldn't? If I don't get the offer, of course, the answer's quite clear. That's fine. I've done my piece, off I go, right? But if I were put in that position, then I think the answer is you have to firstly think about the institution that you're serving, and whether you can continue to contribute to the institution. To the Reserve Bank. I was just invited to serve a second term on the Reserve Bank board by the Treasurer, by Mr. Frydenberg, right, who again rang me up and said, would I, if the government would like me to serve a second term, would I be willing to do that? Now, I could have said, look, thanks, Treasurer, I've had enough. That was good while it lasted. See you later, right? Thank you. As it turns out, because I knew this was coming, that my term was coming up, I'd spoken again to my wife and I said, look, she said, well, do you think you still have things to contribute? And I said, well, I am now, because I've been there 5 years. I'm the longest serving external member of that, right? Because people couldn't go, right? And therefore I have a degree of experience now that has come from having been there through this period. Right? So is that of value to bring to the board as new members come in? Is it of value for me to sort of carry the corporate history for a little while?
Yes.
And I thought at the end of the day, yes, the answer is yes. So if the government offers me, I would accept. And the government did offer, and so I accepted. Now, 2 is the maximum, so it won't happen again. But to answer your question, when you're in that situation, as I will face it quite potentially with the business school and the university, would I extend if I were offered, or would I just stand down? I think the answer is, what can I contribute as a leader in continuing relative to the alternative, Caleb? Relative to the alternative. Because remember, you're always, as a leader, you are trying to bring forward, not in the case of the Reserve Bank, it's not my choice, but in the case of the business school, to grow my successes. Right? Yeah. And are they ready? Is the institution ready? Is it the right time? And when that time comes for the institution's sake, then yes, right? Then it's time for me to go and do something else. But in my experience, and I want your listeners to hear that, I don't think this is often, as it were, done for you, right? In my case, I've had a strong sense of that I've known when the hound of heaven has been saying to me, this is go. And when suddenly you feel as though the ladder has run out of rungs, or you're at the end of the plank, or whatever analogy you want to use, you suddenly think, no. Now it's time to move on, right? I've had that clear sense as well. I hope that's helpful.
It's really helpful, because I think it's and it's something I wrestle with personally. I know a lot of the leaders I talk with, it's the challenge of when to step up, when to step back, when to step sideways. And what I'm hearing from yourself is an ability to step up when you're needed, but then also maybe ability to hold things loosely and wait for the right time to move on, move sideways. I think it's really special, because I think it's hard, because when you serve something, an institution, a church, a business, whatever, you also invest emotionally as well. And that can often be a real difficult thing when you need to step away, because you've got skin in the game. And I think the ability of a top leader is to hold things loose enough that they can step away without tripping over the emotion or feeling like they always need to be there. And I really love what you said about the successes that are coming through, because I think that's something that I've had to learn, is that no matter what leadership position you're in, you are always just there for a moment, and there's always going to be a successor that comes after you. You won't be there forever. We all die one day anyway. And having a leadership attitude of succession is very empowering, not only for yourself, but for everyone around you. So you've spoken a little bit about, please add to that if you'd like, Ian, and then let's...
Well, just a minute. I just wanted to say that you hit the nail on the head there, Caleb, because I think it's very important for everyone, but certainly for leaders to remember that it's not just about you, right? It isn't about you. A famous French president and military leader by the name of de Gaulle, General de Gaulle, right, once said enigmatically that the graveyard is full of indispensable men. Right? Now, he said that at a time when we nowadays would use more inclusive language, right? But what he meant was, okay, that no one is indispensable. Right? The graveyard is full of indispensable men. In other words, yeah, that's right. Don't tell me that you are indispensable. It's only about you. Look over there. Right? There's 50 people lying there who all said the same thing. And what's happened? Well, the world has gone on, hasn't it?
Yes.
The world has gone on. So it's a way of saying you've been given this as a gift, as you say, as an opportunity, right? And yes, it is important that you throw yourself in emotionally, and all the things you say, Caleb, are what make for great leadership. But at the end of the day, right, you need to be reminded that it isn't just about you, right? That the graveyard is full of indispensable men.
Well said. Really well said. Tell us, as we finish off a bit, tell us a little bit about your faith. And I know you probably would have loved to talk more about this today, but it'd be good to hear a little bit. Last time I interviewed you back in 2017, you shared a bit about your story of coming to faith in Jesus Christ. And afterwards, it just impacted so many people. I remember having many conversations where people were really impacted by, wow, this guy Ian, and he's on the Reserve Bank of Australia, and he's obviously a very clever guy. And he didn't only grow up as a Christian and just follow it because it was his a family faith. You had a genuine encounter with God and came to a place of really believing in him. It was just a fantastic story. So maybe you could give us the story again. I would love to hear that, of how you came to faith and why that's important to you.
That's kind of you to say those things, Caleb. Look, for people who are interested in greater detail, of course, I've written that story up in a couple of books, actually, that I published, one called Economics for Life and the other one called Confessions of a Meddlesome Economist.
Wow.
So you might, people who wanted to follow it up could always look up those books and see the story written down. But the short version is, yes, that I hadn't grown up in a Christian household, but my parents did send me to an Anglican school. So I had an introduction to, if you like, formal Christianity. And as some people often remark, that was enough to inoculate me against the main disease. You see. I had an experience with the Christians at an Anglican school. Well, that was it. I think that's a bit cynical, certainly with hindsight, because it did. While I wasn't converted to the faith there. There was certainly, God was at work there and changing my heart. And there are many aspects of that experience, not the least the wonderful hymns of the faith, which in many cases I have learned by heart because I sang them every morning. Now have, of course, much greater meaning and comfort for me, laid down at an early time in my life. But no, the essence of the story, Caleb, is that I was challenged primarily by my wife, who came to faith before I did, and that, as many of the men listening would immediately recognise, can create tensions, as it did in my case. And it became clear to me with various episodes that my wife was determined on this front, and that it wasn't just something that was a passing fad. And so I recognised that, basically I had to take this seriously. And it was when she said to me that she was going to raise our two sons as Christians, and bluntly I could do what I liked, right? I thought, no. If I'm faced with my marriage versus, holding out to some, atheist position or whatever it is I was trying to argue at the time, then I knew where my priorities lay. So at that point I said, yeah, okay, well, I'll agree to go to church, but I'll only agree, pardon me, Caleb, I'll only agree to go to an Anglican church, because I said, and this is maybe a compliment for you down there in Skye, is that I knew that an Anglican church was at least harmless, right? If I'd come to your church, Caleb, I mightn't have had any hope at all, right? But I thought, well, at least an Anglican church is harmless, and so I figured it was no problem going there. As it turned out, of course, God had all of that well and truly under control, and brought me very quickly under the influence of a man who's now still a dear friend of long standing, who was at the time the Anglican minister. He went on to be a bishop of the Anglican Church and was a very distinguished Australian in his own right. He happened to be the vicar, and so very soon after I arrived, he bowled up to have a yarn to me, and it turned out that he wasn't just the vicar, he was also an economist.
Oh, wow.
So God had parked me under the authority of someone who was a professional colleague. And you might think, well, what relevance does that have? Well, the relevance is that I couldn't, pardon me, Caleb, I couldn't immediately dismiss him as somebody who was deluded, right? It's sort of, cottoned onto some superstition, because after all, he was an economist. I mean, give me a break, right? The guy, he's sort of he's a decent guy, he knows what he's doing, right?
Wow.
And so anyway, he, I think it was the second week in, he came up straight up, as economists do, face to face. And he said to me, you don't believe a word of this, do you? And I said, no, I don't. Right?
Wow.
And he said, yeah, I figured that. He said, well, how long are you going to keep coming here so long as you don't believe a word of it? And I thought, that's a reasonable question. So I said, well, listen to me. I said, you listen to me, right? I said, economist to economist. Right? I said, if you can explain to me why I should believe it, right? Thinking to myself, you haven't got any chance. I said, if you can explain to me why I should believe this, then I'll believe it.
Yeah, wow.
And he said, do you mean that? And I said, economist to economist. I said, why would I say that? He said, yeah, I mean that. Thinking to myself, you got no chance. Right? And he looked at me and he said, you're on.
I love it. It's great.
I said, oh, yeah? And he said, yeah. He said, have you got a Bible? I said, I can find one. He said, well, you happy for me to come around to your place on a Tuesday night for a few weeks? I said, oh, yeah. He said,
wow.
Good. He said, then get that Bible. He says, you read it, look in there, you find a book called Mark. He said, you start reading that book. He said, I'll be at your place Tuesday night. So stay for an hour. He said, we'll do a few of these. He said, by the time we've read the book, he said, then we'll have another conversation. And I said, oh, really? Yeah. So anyway, we did. And we started reading this, and he said, now listen, he said, here's the rules of the game, right? He said, you read that. He said, and you can ask me anything you want to ask me. I said, really? You mean that? He said, anything. I said, all right. So I read the book, and as I went through the Gospel of Mark, I had all sorts of questions for him, right? All sorts of, well, really, so this is going to get you, right? So I thought, I'll go. Anyway, what was most impressive, Caleb, you'd be interested in this as a pastor yourself, is that the thing that impressed me most was not that he could explain away or give me answers to various questions. It's when he would say, yeah, good question. Don't know the answer to that. And I would say, you don't know the answer. And he'd say, no, don't know the answer to that. And I'd say, well, hang on, let me get this straight. You don't know the answer to that question, and yet you still believe this to be true. He said, yeah, that's right. And I said, well, how's that supposed to work? And he said, well, I reckon there are lots of things that you don't understand, right? And yet you also believe them to be true. Isn't that right?
Wow.
And I thought, yeah, you got me there, right?
We all do.
You got me there. So anyway, we kept going through this, and we finished the book of Mark. He said, well, what did you think? And I said, well, I'll give you this much. I said, I don't think it was made up. He says, oh, yeah, why not? I said, well, if it was made up, they wouldn't have, had the Jesus express the exasperation with the disciples and, all these things sort of going wrong and this and that. He said, you just wouldn't get it, right? It would have to be a smooth story. And he said, yeah, good. He said, well, then, if that's the case, what do you think about the things that are said, right? He says he's God. Do you actually believe that? And I said, well, I don't know. He said, all right, fair enough. He said, well, you do one more thing. And I said, what's that? He said, I want you to meet me in town. So he went into what was then the Ridley College bookshop. I'm actually on the board of Ridley College these days. I
noticed that too.
I met him there. And he said, have you ever been to a bookshop like this before? And I said, no, I haven't. He said, good. He said, come inside. So I went inside and I saw this bookshop in those days, what it was like, a library. It's completely arrayed with books on theology and religious topics and this and that. And I'm an academic, Caleb. I'm a scholar. Right? And I was immediately, my first feeling was to feel completely, well, what's the right word? Yeah, embarrassed.
Yeah.
I thought, here I am, I call myself a learned person, and I had no idea that there was so much scholarship about the Christian religious traditions. And I thought, oh boy, have you underestimated this? Right? Anyway, so I went in and I said, he said, oh, look, he says, I want to show you a couple of books. And I said, oh, all right. So he went across to the shelf and he pulled off, from the apologetics section, he pulled off a couple of volumes. I can't tell you what they were now. And he opened them up and he said, here, take a look at this, right? Looked at it. And I could see written down there, Caleb, a number of the arguments that I'd been putting to him. Right?
Yeah.
And of course, responses that people have made over the years to these different propositions in this book of Christian apologetics, defense of the faith. And I looked at this and he looked at me and I looked at him and he looked at me and he said, you weren't the first person to think of these things, were you? I said, yeah, all right. I said, how old is this book? He said, about 300 years.
Yeah.
Anyway, he said, no. He said, I didn't want to really embarrass you, but just make the point. And I said, yeah, I get it. He said, no. He said, I want to buy your book. And I said, oh, yeah, what's that? And he said, here. And he bought me a commentary on Mark off the shelf.
Oh, wow.
And he said, look, here's the book, right? He said, now this book goes through that same gospel. And there are scholars here who wrestle with a lot of the questions that you raised and many that you didn't raise. Right? And I said, oh, what? So the answers are there? He said, no. He said, the answers aren't there. Right? He said, a lot of the questions you asked, no one knows the answer. Right? He said, but here's a discussion, a scholarly discussion about, whether it might be this or whether it might be that and so forth. Right? And here, I'll buy this for you. And wow. I said, well, that's very generous. So he bought it for me and I read the book. And again, it just reinforced the impression that I had completely underestimated this and these sort of cheap one-liners that I was coming up with. Yeah, some of them are, but it was pathetic, Caleb. That's what it was. It was pathetic. They were cheap shots relative to the sort of deep scholarship and discussion and argument and disagreement, which you well know you can find about all of these same things, right? Yeah. And so I realized that the notion that somehow I was being sold a bill of goods and that Christianity was just a sort of fluff and that people were deluded and it was a crutch and all that sort of stuff just completely fell away. I thought, no. Anyway, so about a couple of weeks after that, it was Christmas time, actually, and I went to church on Christmas Day with my wife and two sons, and he was conducting the Christmas Day service, and he'd preached about prophet, priest, and king, and the three gifts and so forth, as you would recognize. And anyway, came to communion, as we do in the Anglican Church, and there was a call for communion, and people started getting up from their pews to go forward to the rail for communion. And I sat there, Caleb, and I thought to myself, what do you know? It's actually true.
Wow.
So I got up and I went forward to the communion rail. Anyway, he came along and he saw me there, and he gave me communion, and went along with the rest. And then straight after the service, he came straight down to where I was sitting, and he said, you took communion today? And I said, yeah, that's right. And he said, why? And I said, because it's true.
Wow. That was it.
He gave me a great big hug, and I was in the kingdom, brother.
Wow. That's such a fantastic story.
Yeah. Well, it's a little bit like, not that I'm comparing myself with C.S. Lewis, but it's a little bit like, I got in the sidecar at Oxford, not a Christian, right? I got out. It's a little bit like that. I came to church that day, not a Christian, and I went home from church that day, a Christian. And what's the difference? Well, the difference is that, as Wesley said, there was a strange sort of quickening at the time of the, and I just thought to myself, you know what? It's actually true.
Yeah.
So there's a mixture of rational investigation, a bit of embarrassment, a bit of prompting, a bit of pushing, a bit of the hound of heaven, a bit of God, manipulating people in my life. That is to say, bringing this fellow who whose opinion I would have a high value of anyway, because he's a professional and all this sort of thing. But at the end of the day, and this is for the benefit of listeners who haven't made that leap. So did I take it on because I could prove, like, mathematically that it was correct? No. Right? Did I? But did I just accept it in a wave of emotion? No. Right? So was it, in that sense, was it the same way, similar? Well, yeah, the same way that I would accept other things as true. In other words, a bit of investigation, talking to other people you respect, getting a sense of what it's about, thinking about it, right? And then one day basically saying, you know what? I think it's actually right. And how, what pushes you over that? And in the case of Christian belief, we believe that is actually, as Paul points out, it's a gift of God. It's the Spirit of God that and why does he work then? And why does he work? Well, he works because God loves us. That's the point, right?
Yeah.
And he earnestly wishes for us to do this. And is it all up to us? Well, we have to make a choice. But do you make a choice completely independently? Well, that then, brothers and sisters, that's the mystery, right? At what point, is God actually pushing you by the Spirit? Are you doing all this under your own steam? Right? I mean, But at the end of the day, as the blind man says in John 9, Caleb, I don't know. All I know is this: I was blind, and now I see.
Yeah. Well done. It's a great way to sum it up. What a fantastic story. I think that that priest sounds like a much better pastor than I am. I think he really understood you, didn't he? He journeyed with you. He understood you. He tracked with you well. Very, very clever. I think that's great.
Well, but that's also a gift from God, Caleb. So you see, we're still close friends at these years later, right? So don't be too hard on yourself, mate. I don't think this was calculated, but he was just responding, in the same way that I was responding. But the difference is, the difference is that, as we were talking about leadership before, he had an opportunity and he took it. Right?
Yeah, good point.
And in a sense, I had an opportunity as well, right? If you explain this in a way that I can believe it, I'll believe it, right? And he said, do you mean that? And I said, yeah, why would I lie to you, right? Okay, you're wrong. So there's a sort of, two characters who are sharing their professional expertise, because he would be saying the same thing about some economic proposition. I'd say, yeah, I don't believe it. What? So is unemployment going to go up or down? Well, I do. Well, you show me. That type of thing was brought into play in this instance as the sort of preliminary to what was ultimately a conversion story.
Yeah. I always find it so ironic, Ian, because we live in this supposed rational age, and Christianity is more rational than any other religion, than any other ideology. There's far more evidence for Christ and the case for Christ, as we know, than any other ancient figure. And as you found out, there's a phenomenal amount of literature, probably more than anything else in the world. The existence of God has been studied. The Bible has been studied. And I remember looking into, a few years ago, the whole New Atheist movement with Hitchens and Sam Harris and all of that. And all of their arguments against Christianity are all arguments that have been dealt with for centuries and centuries, even millennia. And but it captures a new generation that think they understand and they see the light, and religion is just a waste of time. But it's like, we've been here many times over the last 2,000 years. They're just age-old questions that have been asked, that have been answered time and time again. And I think, again, the ignorance of people around Christianity is really sad, because if people like yourself, if people would be open to listen, to search for the truth. And this is what I often say to my friends who aren't believers, is that I haven't come to Christianity because I grew up in it as a child. I've come to Christianity because I sought the truth and I found the truth in it. And I continue to find the truth. And I encourage people to seek the truth, not to do church activities or to try and live some good life like you should, because Jesus said, but it's deeper than that. Seek the truth and see what you'll find. And obviously, as Christians, we believe that at the end of the day, the truth, the bottom of all of the truth, is you'll bump into Jesus eventually. So I love your story, because it's got that strong rational part of the journey, which I think is often underestimated and missed and even misunderstood. Mm.
Yeah, well, what they need is a good trip to the Ridley College bookshop. Still there. You can go along to your local Coorong. But the other point I would make, give my friend Greg Sheridan a plug. That
Yes.
Greg is a foreign correspondent for the Australian newspaper. Some of your
his book, last book, is
very
brilliant.
strong Catholic Christian. And Greg's book, Christians: The Urgent Case for Jesus in Our Lives, right, is a terrific read for people who are like I was, right? And of course, Greg does exactly what you just said, Caleb. He takes people through all of that evidence and pointing out, there are more extant copies of the Christian Gospels in existence. Copies of the original in in vellum and manuscript. More of those in existence than any other ancient document, and I mean, by orders of magnitude. And so, we have no problem believing that Thucydides ever wrote, or that, Julius Caesar lived, and Cleopatra, right? We got no problem believing that they all existed. And yet the evidence written down that I can literally go to a museum or a great library and show you, right, that's tiny alongside the evidence that these Gospels were actually written and that the events that were described there actually occurred. So anyway, if people haven't read Greg's book, it's a great read, and in it you'll also hear some stories about Christians, including, of course, our Prime Minister and other figures who have their stories briefly mentioned in the same book.
Yeah. No, I've noticed that book. It's a great one. Look, Ian, let's tie it up for today. It's just been a fantastic conversation. We really appreciate your time, everything that you've told us about the economy, the Reserve Bank of Australia, your journey, the Order of Australia, how you've come to faith. All of it's just been very, very rich and super interesting. I've had a great time. So thank you very much.
It's my pleasure, Caleb. Well, best wishes to you and your family, and of course to all the listeners. Keep safe and well. God bless you.
Thanks, man.
I trust you were impacted by that Leadership Lessons podcast. I would love to hear your thoughts about today's podcast. Please comment down below, and please review the podcast and share it with a friend. Doing this inspires us and helps others to find the podcast. See you next time.